Blood DKs have been riding high in Dragonflight Season 3. They're the #1 most popular tank in the game in raids, and #3 in Mythic Plus. So what's made them so good, and what accounts for that drop from raid to Mythic Plus? Hi, it's Llarold, and today I'm going to talk about how to play Blood DK in Dragonflight patch 10.2.5. Since it's the middle of the season, this will be specifically oriented toward Mythic Plus, and with that being said, let's just get right into it. In the past, I've complained a lot about Blood DK's big problem, dealing damage, and how that really held them back from just being the best tank in the game in raids and one of the best in Mythic Plus. That time is over now. Between a series of damage buffs to their core skills throughout the entire expansion, and their current tier set bonus granting a lot of extra damage, Blood DKs are doing more damage now than at any point in recent memory. They're a top 2 tank in raid in terms of damage, only behind Vengeance Demon Hunter, and a top 3 tank in Mythic Plus behind Vengeance and Brewmaster Monk. In raids, their defenses and group utility aren't a problem. There is no problem with Blood DK. 0 weaknesses, all strength. It's just the best tank in the game. In raids. In Mythic Plus, it still has 2 major problems, and these are why it's in 3rd place. It's only used as the tank in about 15% of all runs above a plus 20. Now, to be fair, 15% is pretty good compared to Brewmaster Monk and Protection Warrior, who are sitting around 5%. But with Vengeance Demon Hunter over 40% and Prot Pally over 25%, Blood DK feels like it's a long way back from the best in terms of Mythic Plus popularity. Blood DK has a serious issue with making pulls, and this is actually both of the problems it has in Mythic Plus. Generating Bone Shield charges and Runic Power so you can cast Death Strike and stay alive are super important, but these are mostly single target or cleave skills. Your main AoE threat tools, Blood Boil and Death and Decay, don't really help with your defenses in a meaningful way. So on the one hand, staying alive at the start of dangerous pulls is difficult because you're trying to establish threat. But also, establishing threat at the start of a pull across a group of enemies is difficult because you're trying to stay alive. And both of those goals are directly at odds with each other. Abomination Limb and Dancing Rune Weapon help alleviate these problems, but they're cooldowns, so the start of pulls when you don't have one or both of these available can be pretty tough. This is ultimately the reason why Blood DK struggles at the highest levels of key pushing. It's not really an issue if you just want to do weekly keys or even push up into the plus 25 range, but it does mean that you're going to have a hard ceiling eventually, and for high key pushers whose goal is to push keys as high as they possibly can, and who have a major effect on the community's preferred classes, that kind of makes Blood DK an unappealing proposition to even start playing in the first place. Why would a high-level player put in the effort to gear and play a Blood DK if they know the end of the road for it comes 2 key levels sooner than it does for a Vengeance Demon Hunter? Putting a positive spin on the state of Blood DK right now is very easy. It's amazing! This is one of the best versions of the class that's ever existed, and it's still great in Mythic Plus. I've been gearing up my Blood DK recently because I'm kind of thinking of swapping from Paladin to DK and Raid, and I've gotta say, it has been a real pleasure to play. You have an incredible amount of control over your own survival, and over caster and archer mobs, and that's really good. Blood DK's ability to grip enemies together seriously helps a group's DPS, and it can prevent a lot of accidental extra pulls. This is a deeply underrated strength of the class. Blood DKs aren't amazing at helping a group with affixes, which is probably one of the bigger downsides to the class in Mythic Plus, but they're not totally worthless either. It's about 50-50. You can take Control Undead and use that to mind control incorporeal enemies. This is really good and really helpful. You can grip enemies out of Sanguine quickly. You can use Death and Decay slow to lock down spiteful ads. You can use Anti-Magic Shell or Anti-Magic Zone to help mitigate bursting, either personally or for the group. That can help a bit. You can use Death's Advance to immune the knockup from storming and clear those out, I guess. You can also use an Anti-Magic Shell to prevent entangling from applying to you. That's all great. When it comes to most of the other affixes, you're not as great. You technically can cast Death Coil into afflicted NPCs, but don't do that. That's super painful. You really can't do anything about raging. You really can't help with bolstering. I guess pop cooldowns or get ready to kite when you have a really bolstered mob at the end of a pull. Now let's move on to Blood Death Knight's tier set bonuses. The 2-piece makes it so that consuming Runic Power has a chance to cause your next hard strike to apply Ashen Decay. Ashen Decay reduces damage dealt to you by 10% and increases your damage dealt to afflicted targets by 20%, and it lasts for 8 seconds. The 4-piece makes it so that Soul Reapers execute damage, which you don't use Soul Reaper in Mythic Plus, but Abomination Limbs damage as well apply Ashen Decay to enemy targets. It also makes it so that Heartstrike and Blood Boil's direct damage extends Ashen Decay by 1 second. So between the 2-piece and 4-piece, you can maintain this buff around 90 to 95% uptime pretty reliably, and that's very good. The only real downside here is that the debuff is only applied by Heartstrike, so you aren't going to consistently apply it to more than 5 targets at once, and that is not great in Mythic Plus. Now, one big positive here is that this makes Abomination Limb a lot stronger at the start of pulls, because now not only is it doing AoE damage, generating Bone Shield charges, and gathering up packs of enemies like it normally does, it's also giving you 10% damage reduction and 20% more damage. That's excellent. If this tier set bonus could be applied, or even just spread by Blood Boil instead of Heartstrike, that would make it way stronger in Mythic Plus. Now maybe that would be too powerful, but I don't really think so. I think 10% DR and 20% more damage, with the state of Blood Decay as it is, would be pretty good. I don't think that would be overpowered. Not when you look at Vengeance Demon Hunter or Prot Paladin. I think it would be just fine. Unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. Now this tier set won't be sticking around for Season 4, and I think that's probably a good thing given that Season 4 is primarily going to be focused on Mythic Plus. The community voted to bring back the Season 2 tier set bonus, which grants random Vampiric Blood procs and gives you a major strength bonus anytime you gain Vampiric Blood. So I think that Season 4 could be an even better time for Blood Decays than Season 3 has been. Now let's talk about talents, and I only have one main talent setup to consider here with some minor swaps for affixes, dungeon differences, and personal preference. Alright, so here I have the standard talent tree for Mythic Plus for Blood Decays. Now, just sort of as a preface to all of this is the standard setup. This is what the vast majority of people will run for any sort of Mythic Plus, but especially anything 20 and up. That doesn't mean you can't experiment. Certainly you're free to do that, just know that this is kind of the accepted standard at this point. Now you'll note that I have some pending changes here, and that's because there is about 1 point worth of real wiggle room in the left-hand tree. A lot of people will just sort of take a anti-magic zone as their default. That's a pretty good default fallback. You know, you can throw it down for the group. They can stand in it if they want to mitigate some damage. Pretty useful for dealing with some group mechanics. But you can also put that point into permafrost just to give yourself some more shielding. This is pretty good on fortified weeks as a general, just sort of a generic damage reduction talent for yourself, as opposed to a damage reduction active skill for the group. You can also take Control Undead, which is really, really good on afflicted weeks. Nope, incorporeal weeks. And I really like Control Undead in Ataldazar and Black Rockhold, being able to MC some of the undead guys and some of the pulls, particularly the big guys on the way to Volcall in Ataldazar. Just keeping one of those guys around for the whole dungeon is pretty nice. It adds not a ton of damage, but, you know, getting a couple percent of damage, and I think that's about what it adds, 3 to 5% or something. But 3 to 5% for a single talent point that's like in the upper half of the class tree is insane compared to like an anti-magic zone that you may not ever remember to cast, or permafrost giving you a very moderate amount of shielding throughout a dungeon. Now in the right-hand tree, you do have some more wiggle room. This is sort of the accepted standard setup that deals more damage. We have Heartbreaker here, we have improved Heartstrike, Heartbreaker giving you more runic power in AoE situations, up to 25 runic power per Heartstrike as opposed to the base of 15, which is quite good. This is pretty normally taken. And it does basically come at the expense of taking Rune Tap and taking Foul Bulwark, which Foul Bulwark gives you anywhere from like 5 to 10% more max health, which is pretty good, but given that Blood Decay's defenses right now aren't a concern, Foul Bulwark really isn't like mandatory. So that's kind of where we're at. Rune Tap, especially with Heartbreaker really rising in popularity, Rune Tap basically competes with Heartbreaker for, you know, you could get 25 runic power and a bunch of damage out of a rune by casting Heartstrike, or you could get 10 runic power and a very small damage reduction cooldown. Like, you know, why even waste a talent point on Rune Tap? All right, so one major tweak that people will do when they're trying to make their tree quite a bit more tanky is they will drop Bloodshot down here at the bottom of the tree, take a second point in Red Thirst, and they'll drop Hemostasis, and they'll come down and take Umbilicus Eternus. Now, usually when you do this, you're also going to drop improved Heartstrike, so your tree would actually look a bit more like this. You would take improved Vampiric Blood instead, drop improved Heartstrike, 2 points in Red Thirst, and 1 point in Umbilicus Eternus. This was a really common setup with the Season 2 tier set bonus that favored Vampiric Blood and kind of turned it into a semi-offensive cooldown. And this really just leans a lot heavier on Vampiric Blood. You're getting more cooldown reduction out of Red Thirst, you're getting a lot of extra defensive value after it fades out of Umbilicus Eternus, and then you're getting more uptime and more value out of it while it's active with improved Vampiric Blood. The problem with running this setup is you lose a lot of damage from improved Heartstrike, you lose a lot of damage from Bloodshot, and you know, a lot of Blood DKs in Mythic Plus aren't really willing to give up that damage output because Blood DK damage in Mythic Plus is actually really good right now. And I think that's pretty justifiable. Other than that, there's not a ton of wiggle room, not a ton of experimentation happening right now. People aren't using Bone Storm, people aren't using Gorfine's Grasp. I mean, they're talents that I love. People aren't taking Blood Tap anymore. All talents that I love, all forms of power that I really enjoy and miss, but this current setup is pretty optimized, pretty well thought out and optimized. And I gotta say, having experimented with those other options a bit, they're really not as fun. So I get why this is the standard setup, and I gotta say I really enjoy playing it. All right, that's it. All right, now let's move on to abilities. Blood DK is a tank built around maintaining a lot of buffs and managing a lot of resources. You don't want to let any of the buffs fall off, and you don't want to waste any of the resources. Once you're able to manage all of that, you'll have a great time. First off, you want to maintain Bone Shield at all times. The maximum number of Bone Shield stacks is 10. You always want to maintain at least 5. Death's Caress and Marrow Rend both generate Bone Shield charges. Marrow Rend generates 3 and it costs 2 runes, Death's Caress generates 2 and it only costs 1 rune. This makes Death's Caress more efficient, but Marrow Rend deals a lot more damage, so it is the better option for maintaining Bone Shield most of the time. If you don't have enough runes, or you're forced out of melee range for some reason, Death's Caress can still be useful. If you have Dancing Rune Weapon active, your skills hit 3 times, so Marrow Rend will generate 9 Bone Shield charges, and Death's Caress will grant 6. This can be a great way to keep your Bone Shield charges active for cheap, and it allows you to deal more damage and generate more runic power during that Dancing Rune Weapon window by using Heartstrike. Next, you want to maintain Icy Talons, and to do that you need to cast Death Strike at least every 10 seconds. You'll probably need to use Death Strike more often than that to heal yourself, but you should at least use it at once every 10 seconds. You should use it also whenever you're about to cap on runic power. That really is the defining trait of when you should use Death Strike. Never let yourself cap on any of your resources. And obviously you want to use it whenever you need healing. Never letting Bone Shield fall off and using Death Strike to heal are the backbone of playing Blood DK. If you can master that, you're well on your way to constructing the rest of Blood DK's skeleton. In addition to that, you want to maintain Death and Decay at all times. This is not really that complicated. You just want to either cast it where you're standing if you're not moving, or if you need to move, you can either cast it where you're heading, or wait until you've stopped moving and then recast it where you're standing. When it fades, refresh it as quickly as you can. Once you've managed everything else, you can use Heartstrike to keep your runes on cooldown and generate runic power. It generates an extra 5 runic power by default, but potentially up to 25 total runic power in AoE pulls. Finally, Blood Boil is your filler skill of last resort, and it is a very simple AoE damage skill that is extremely important early in pulls for picking up threat, but otherwise it's mainly just used to fill empty global cooldowns. By casting Blood Boil, occasionally you also maintain Blood Plague, which deals a bit of damage and leeches it back to you. It's basically just another maintenance buff. Now let's move on to cooldowns. You have Abomination Limb, Empower Rune Weapon, Dancing Rune Weapon, and Raise Dead. That's a pretty good collection. Abomination Limb and Empower Rune Weapon are both resource generators and offensive cooldowns. Abomination Limb generates Bone Shield charges, grips nearby enemies toward you, and deals AoE damage. It also applies your tier set bonus. It's a really good skill, and unless you're holding it to grip enemies together for a specific purpose, you want to try to use it on cooldown most of the time. If I'm nearing the end of a pull, I usually will hold it for the start of the next one because it really trivializes the challenge of establishing threat and getting enemies together and getting resources generated at the start of a pull. Empower Rune Weapon gives you a ton of resource generation and a big haste buff. You really want to use this on cooldown as well, and since it has the same cooldown as Abomination Limb, you ideally want to layer them both right over the top of each other. It is off the global cooldown, so using them at the same time is easy. A lot of people just macro them together, and I think that's fine. I don't do it that way. Maybe I should consider it. It's completely fine if Empower Rune Weapon restores runes at the start of a pull when you're still getting your runes on cooldown. Having this synced up with Abomination Limb and your Ghoul is more important, and you really want to use this as much as you possibly can. You don't want to sit on Empower Rune Weapon until you have run out of runes and then try to use it as a rune restore cooldown. Just fire it on cooldown unless a pull is about to end or you're coming up to an immunity intermission phase on a boss or something that would constitute a break in combat. Raise Dead, the Ghoul, is actually a meaningful defensive cooldown now. Your Ghoul is pretty basic. You summon him, he auto-attacks enemies. Sometimes those auto-attacks make them deal less damage to you. It deals a little bit of damage as well. That's pretty much it, but it's good, and more importantly, it's off the global cooldown, so you should try to use him on cooldown too. You probably could macro him into Empower Rune Weapon and A-Bomb Limb as well, honestly, if you wanted to just be super lazy with it. You have Dancing Rune Weapon as well. This is a mix of both an offensive and defensive cooldown. With the standard talent setup, the one everybody runs, you summon 2 Dancing Rune Weapon copies that deal an extra 33% of your damage. They copy all of your spell casts, and some of this works really well. Marrowrin and Death's Caress giving you triple bone shield charges is kind of the prime example. The threat your weapons generate also carries over to you, so it's pretty amazing for holding threat at the start of pulls. Your Heartstrike runic power generation is also significantly increased by having Dancing Rune Weapon active. Now, because of that amazing cluster of talents in the central line of the Blood DK talent tree, you want to use Dancing Rune Weapon pretty much as often as you can. Just like everything else, unless you're approaching the very end of a pull, you want to basically pop it on cooldown as much as you can. At the start of pulls is really ideal. It is a major cooldown, and it gets a ton of cooldown reduction from normal tanking behavior, so you really want to do everything you can to maximize its value. Now let's talk about Tombstone. Tombstone is a little weird, a little different. It's a 1-minute cooldown that consumes 5 Bone Shield charges, generates runic power, and gives you a shield worth 30% of your maximum health. The way you use Tombstone is pretty straightforward. You want to try to use it immediately on cooldown as much as possible, kinda just like everything else. There is a short list of requirements that you need to basically go through a check down on before you cast Tombstone though. First off, make sure Dancing Rune Weapon is on cooldown and that you'll get full cooldown reduction value from Tombstone by using it. If Dancing Rune Weapon is like 5 seconds or 10 seconds away from coming back off cooldown, wait for Dancing Rune Weapon to come back up naturally and then use Tombstone pretty much immediately afterward. You should also make sure you have at least 6 Bone Shield charges. You want to consume 5, so you need 5, but you don't want to have 0 Bone Shield charges once you've hit Tombstone, so you want to get to at least 6 or more, and then Tombstone down to that lower number, and then immediately regen more Bone Shield charges. Finally, you want to be sure you're standing in Death and Decay. Being in Death and Decay triples the damage of your Shattering Bone, and Shattering Bone is what makes Tombstone, what is generally just a purely defensive cooldown, into actually a pretty strong offensive cooldown and a really good AoE threat tool at the start of pulls. Using Tombstone does count as 5 hits of Shattering Bone, so if you're standing in Death and Decay, that's 15 hits worth of Shattering Bone damage. You obviously want that extra damage, so make sure that you're in Death and Decay before you hit Tombstone. Every single cooldown I've mentioned already has some sort of offensive and defensive component to it, whether it's direct or through a talent. So now I want to just talk about the purely defensive cooldowns, of which there are only a few. Icebound Fortitude, Lichborn, and Anti-Magic Shell are the main 3. They are both basic damage reduction cooldowns, and they're capable of preventing or breaking you out of crowd controls. Icebound Fortitude makes you immune to stuns, Lichborn makes you immune to fear, sleep, and mind control, and Anti-Magic Shell prevents magic debuffs from being applied while it's active. Basically, you just press them before you're about to take a lot of damage, then you take less, and you maybe prevent a crowd control effect. In the case of Icebound Fortitude and Lichborn, you can use them retroactively. Maybe you didn't intend to get hit by a stun and then you accidentally got stunned. You can hit Icebound Fortitude and break out and Death Strike and be okay. Anti-Magic Shell is sort of the one outsider here. If you get a debuff on you that you didn't want to have happen, you can hit Anti-Magic Shell and it will mitigate the damage, but that debuff's already applied. The final 2 cooldowns are Vampiric Blood and Rune Tap. I didn't forget them. Rune Tap is a talent and its value is pretty small. It has really fallen out of favor in Season 3, and the reason for that is that it competes with Heartstrike for runes, which makes it pretty questionable in most situations. It can be a reliable source of damage if you really need another defensive tool, but it's typically not that great, especially in Mythic Plus. Vampiric Blood, on the other hand, is an amazing defensive cooldown. It gives you a bunch of extra health and makes you take a lot more healing. It's super duper strong, and it's kind of the defining cooldown of Blood Decay thematically, even if some of the others like Anti-Magic Shell and Icebound Fortitude are more iconic. If you spec into the more defensive talent setup with improved Vampiric Blood and Umbilicus Eternus, and 2 points into Red Thirst, it becomes an insanely powerful defensive layer that is available super often. It really feels unfair just how much defensiveness Vampiric Blood provides relative to its cooldown once you've fully spec'd into it. Now let's talk about the most challenging aspect of playing a Blood Decay, how to manage pulls. This is something I always go over specifically because I know pulling packs of mobs in dungeons can be challenging for newer players, especially on a Blood Decay. Opening up by getting Death and Decay down early is important. If you're using Grip of the Dead, and you should be, this has the added benefit of keeping enemies super duper slow. They're basically locked in place by that 90% slow from Death and Decay. You also want to get Bone Shield charges up and running immediately. So casting D&D and then Death's Caress while you're still walking into melee range can be a good idea. If you have your collection of cooldowns available, then you want to pop them as you get into melee range. We're talking Dancing Rune Weapon, Abomination Limb, Empower Rune Weapon, Raise Ghoul, and then you can Blood Boil a couple of times to tag all the enemies in the pack, establish threat, use Tombstone to get it on cooldown, and begin your normal rotation by casting Death Strike, Heart Strike, and so on. If you don't have cooldowns available, holding threat in AoE is a lot more difficult, but you want to just rely on the tools you have. Blood Boil and Death and Decay will do the heavy lifting for you. They've been buffed a lot throughout Dragonflight, and honestly, they do a good job of establishing AoE threat on their own. The main difficulty that they have is they don't help with maintaining Bone Shield or generating runic power, so they're at odds with generating defensive resources, and managing that aspect of the class while also establishing AoE threat can be challenging without cooldowns. It's not that difficult, it's not impossible, but it is different from most other tanks who generate resources and establish AoE threat with the same tools. We're talking things like Keg Smash and Thrash and Thunderclap. So in the case where you have no cooldowns, you'll want to establish initial threat with Death and Decay, get Bone Shield charges up while moving into melee range with Death's Caress, maintain threat with Blood Boil once you're in melee range, maintain Bone Shield charges once you're in melee range with Marrow Rend, and then you can transition into your normal rotation. Strength is the most important stat to Blood Decays. This means that whenever possible, you want to maximize your item level. If you're comparing items that are at or very close to the same level, haste is the best secondary stat, and the rest of the secondary stats are fairly good. You will want to enchant and gem for haste as your number one secondary stat, and then your second best secondary stat is kind of dependent on the rest of your gear. I wouldn't worry about it too much. I think for enchants, gems, crafted gear, versatility is a pretty good safe bet as your number two secondary stat. That's what I prefer. It's the most consistent for all around damage mitigation and damage output. I have seen some Blood Decays and high level keys use Haste Mastery for more reliable physical damage mitigation for Blood Shield. I've seen people use Haste Crit because it's better for damage reduction overall just by more parry chance, and it's really good for damage output. It is a little less consistent than Versatility or Mastery, so there is that to consider. All of them are pretty good. Finally, be sure to use Fallen Crusader as your weapon enchant. The alternatives to it are nowhere close to its value. Okay, that's Blood Decay. It is a really strong tank right now, and I have been absolutely enjoying mine in this season. I'm definitely planning to play a lot more of it in Season 4. It might be my main for Season 4, to be honest. I think it's very likely to go up in power and popularity. We don't know what class changes will be, but Blood Decay is already a class in really great shape right now, so I think the sky is the limit. Alright, that's it. Thanks for watching. Bye.